Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Pei Vav. Today's stuff is sponsored by Penina Lipsker in honor of her son's wedding, Daniel, to Ella, and in loving memory of his friends, Yakir Hexter and David Schwartz, Hashem Yikom Damam, who were killed during the war. May we know only smachot. Today's stuff is sponsored by Beth Kiselev Perlman in honor of the occasion of her daughter, on the Aliyah of her daughter, Yael Perlman, and her new husband, Matt Shapiro, making Aliyah to Jerusalem on Sunday. We're so proud of their decision and look forward to sharing their experiences of their new life in the Holy Land. It's all tov to all young new couples there. And with that, we'll get started. So we're going to learn about, we're going to try to finish up the sugya of the question that Rav Sheshet asked Rav Huna. So let's just do a review of what we saw in yesterday's daf. We had two basic questions. Today, we're going to the two will come together a little bit and try to reconcile the seeming overlap of the two. The first was the ruling of Rav and Shmuel, and then of Rabbi Yochanan, where there was this debate about what Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish really held. That was Rav and Shmuel. Your own kelim, if you put something, you buy something, and you put it in your own utensils, your own bag, your own bowl, whatever it might be, it acquires the object for you everywhere, wherever you are, other than the public domain. To which Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish said, even in the public domain, but then we narrow that to maybe they're talking only about a simtat. Didn't really make much sense otherwise, but it's a little bit open whether there's an opinion that even in Rishut or Rabin. Then Rav Sheshet asked Rav Huna, well, can it acquire in the domain of the seller? Now, Rish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan, Rav Shmuel, all of them didn't really address that head on. It sounded like they would have included the kli of the seller in the domain of the seller as well. But Rav Sheshet asked this question, which might mean that maybe they weren't referring to that exactly, and we'll have to reconcile that. That will be our fourth source we're going to see today. Okay, not the fourth one we'll see today, but the fourth source in the sugya is actually the beginning of our sugya, Rav and Shmuel. But right now, what we did was we tried to figure out, first, they brought this Mishna in Gittin, which we said, no. The Mishna in Gittin already there in the sugya, they said, well, since there's no answer to Rav Sheshet's question, it must be this Mishnah. It can't be understood as simply as we think it is, and not necessarily. Remember, the whole way a kli could potentially acquire is because we view this like a chatzer. It's as if in that vessel of the buyer, it's as if that vessel is like its own, like a courtyard, you could almost view it as an extension of the buyer, him or herself, and therefore whatever's in there is as if they acquired through a kinyan chatzer. But we can't learn it from Get, where you could throw it into her basket, because they had all sorts of crazy ukimtot. Then we tried to learn it from this other source, and we said, no, maybe it wasn't talking about the kelim of the mocher, this braita we saw yesterday. Now we're on the third braita. I don't want to spend too much time reviewing, otherwise we'll never move forward. I just wanted to get the structure. Today we're going to deal with things in fours. The next week is also going to have four sources. Tashma. So we're going to review from the beginning of the source because we kind of stopped in the middle and didn't yet see the connection to our sugya. So basically, you're selling me something. You send the items with donkeys, on riding on donkeys with a donkey rider or with workers who are carrying it. They get to my house and they start unloading the stuff into my house. Okay, whether either they agreed on a price, but they haven't yet measured anything out yet, or they measured everything out, but hadn't yet agreed on a price, the deal is not done. Okay, even though you put the stuff into my property. But Pirkan, this isn't Pirkan yet. Sorry, I said it wrong. This is when I was Moshech the workers. I pulled the workers, but I didn't pull the actual items. Okay, so I pulled the workers and I pulled the workers into my house, and with the workers is all the stuff, right? So it's on their shoulders, or I pulled the donkey riders with the donkeys into my property. Okay, but basically there hasn't been any sort of, right? So whether the stuff was measured out or whether there was an agreed price, but you didn't have both, this is nothing. But Pirkan v'chnisan l'toch beito. But if they took everything off their backs, their loads, or off the donkeys, and they put it into my house, okay? And here it says, bein mocher, bein lokeach, the Rashbam says. It doesn't matter if it was the seller who did it or the seller's workers, or it doesn't matter if I did it, I was the buyer. Hasat ad shalom madad, if we already had agreed on a price, and they or me empty the stuff into my house, even if it wasn't yet measured out. Okay, let's say, what does it mean it wasn't yet measured out? Well, aren't they putting it into my house as if they're selling it to me? Let's say there's 5 pounds of stuff, 5 pounds of rice, okay? And I bought 2 pounds of rice. That was the agreed upon amount. We assume there's an agreed upon amount, and they just haven't measured out the 2 from the 5. What it means here is the deal is done, even though there's 5 in my house right now, only 2 will be mine because I'm not going to acquire something that we didn't discuss I was buying. But if I said I was going to buy 2, even though we haven't measured the 2 out, it just means that we can't renege on the deal. It's too late. Those 2 are as if they're fully acquired by me. That's going to be the important line we're going to go back to. Madad ad shelo pasak, but first we have to finish the braita. Madad ad shelo pasak, if they measured out, let's say, the 2 pounds, but we haven't agreed on a price of what 2 pounds are going to cost, shnehem yicholim lachzor beh. Well, then either one can renege on the deal, because as long as you haven't set a price, there's no deal. And we'll talk about that soon. The Gemara is going to go back to that once they try to say why they think this source is going to give us an answer to the question, and then they're going to reject it. Then they're going to go back and say, why is setting the price so important? But the main thing they're going to focus on right now is, well, the assumption is, if the stuff is on the donkey riders, remember we learned all about the saddlebags and the, all these bags that they carry their equipment on, not the equipment, the merchandise. So the assumption is, how they take it out of the donkey? They picked up the bag that belonged to who? The seller, obviously. And they put the bag in my house. So now that's not what we're looking for. Remember, we're looking for the reverse, the opposite case. The buyer's utensils, vessels in the seller's house. But they're going to say it should be one and the same. Now, some people have a different version that works a little better, the words here, but let's just explain what it means. If it's in the seller's vessels, but it's in my property as the buyer, what did we just learn? Lo kana really means it no longer belongs to the seller, even though it's in the seller's vessels. Because what? Remember how the Rashbam explained the question in the first place? Do we view these vessels as secondary to the land it's in? And if it's in the land of the seller, then it should belong to the seller. And it doesn't matter that the vessel belongs to the buyer. Or do we say, no, this is like a little island, you could say, of the buyers in the seller's house. So in our case, it's the reverse, but it's the same idea. If the seller's vessels are in my house with all the merchandise, and we view it as my own, it's because what determines it? Whose domain is it in? It's in my domain. The vessel is insignificant. It's nullified in light of the fact that it's in my house. So that's what it's sounding like here. And therefore, likewise, the vessels of the buyer, the vessels of the buyer in the seller's property should also not acquire it for the buyer. In other words, in one case, lo kana, meaning it's no longer in the property of the sellers. And in this case of the buyer, if it's in the buyer's vessels, it's not yet in the hands of the buyer. And that's the same logic because, again, what determines what domain it's in and not what vessel it's in? And that would be an answer to the question. To which, I'm Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, what are you talking about? You could explain, we're going to have 2 possible explanations as to why this wouldn't prove it. You can explain this braita, b'sheshafchan. It's a case where they poured the stuff out. Why are you assuming it's in the vessels of the buyer still, of the seller still? You could just assume that what happened, the donkey riders came, took the stuff off, and spilled it out on the floor. To which ikpe Rava. Rava got very upset with this answer and said, Midi shafchan katani? Pirkan katani. It doesn't say they spilled it. It says they unloaded it. What does unloading mean? Unloading means, right? Imagine nowadays, right? They bring you a delivery from the fruit store. Instead of bringing it in a box, which is basically going to become yours, and they're going to leave it with you, whether you like it or not, right? So it's a problem to get rid of all those boxes they bring. But basically, what we're saying is they're putting it in their own crate. They bring their crate into your house, and then they're going to unload the crate, put it on your floor, and then they're going to take their crate back, right? That's when you say pirkan, that's normally what we assume. It's in the bags, it's in a crate, it's in something that belongs to them. It doesn't, they wanted to say they spilled it out on your floor, it would have said shafchan. It wouldn't say pirkan. The word pirkan means they unloaded the stuff, which basically usually means they put it, right? One could argue with that, but Rava doesn't like this answer. So it is a possible answer, but Rava doesn't like it. And then again, as soon as we say this isn't in the kelim of the mocher, then it teaches us nothing about our topic. El Amar Rav Ashi. So Mar, the son of Rav Ashi, gives a different answer. Bimitakle de tume. Tume is shum, because taf and shin switch. Shum is garlic. It's talking about heads of garlic that are bound together, and they don't usually go in a bag. Okay, I was thinking, sometimes people hang garlics all in a thing. People do it also for superstitious reasons. They probably hung it on the donkey. It wasn't even in a bag in the first place, it sounds like. First of all, garlic doesn't get dirty, really, because you're going to peel it anyway. It doesn't matter if it's dirty. So it could be, we're talking about something that for whatever reason, say, heads of garlic don't really come in bags usually. And that's why there is no vessel at all. So you don't have to say shafchan, we spilled it out. So we unloaded it, but we unloaded it because it didn't even have a bag to it or anything. So therefore, that teaches us nothing about our topic again, because it wasn't a similar case. And we're done with that source, except we have one thing we have to resolve, which I said we come back to. Now they say, Michti Pirkan Katane. Now, Amar Lehuna Bered Marzutra Le Ravina. So Huna, the son of Marzutra, says to Ravina the following question. Michti Pirkan Katane. Now, once it says, we took it off, we put it, the donkey riders put it, or the workers put it in my house. Mali pasak, mali lo pasak. If they already put it down in my possession, what does it matter if we agreed on a price or we didn't agree on a price? Theoretically, it's already in my domain. It should be mine. So they say no. Because Amarle, pasak, he explains to him why. In other words, nobody thought that was the case, but he was just saying, I don't understand why that's the significant issue. Pasak samchadate, lo pasak, lo samchadate. If we haven't agreed on a price, then both the seller and the buyer may never agree to the terms, right? Until we've negotiated a price, then it's not clear whether you might want a really high price and I'll say, oh, I didn't realize that's too expensive for me. Right? Has ever happened to you where you're going to buy something and you assume it's reasonable and then you get to the checkout counter and you find out what the price is and you say, no, thanks, I'm not going to take that. So that, right, it's very common. So until you know the price, you're not going to necessarily know that you're actually going to buy it, and therefore it can't become yours. And likewise, the seller might not agree, because the seller might say one price and you'll say, I don't want to pay that, and you'll only pay less. And then you come to some agreement, but until you come to that agreement, maybe the seller doesn't give you rights to the object because he's not sure that you're going to actually buy it, or not sure that you're not sure that the seller's actually going to sell it to you. So until we agree on a price, there's no transfer of ownership. That's just a given. Okay, we're going to see this topic come up later as well. Not today, another day. Source number 4, fourth attempt to answer. Just want to point out something structurally. We started with a question. Rav Sheshet asked Rav Huna. Rav Huna brought the first answer. Then the next two answers are mentioned stam, without a name. It could be Rav Huna brought them. It could be someone else brought them. Probably it's not even Rav Huna who brought them. Fourth answer comes with a name of who brought it. Amale Ravina le Rav Ashi. Ravina said to Rav Ashi, Tashma, I have a source. And what source? None other than, and the reason this probably comes at the end of the sugya also, not only because Ravina and Rav Ashi are the last generation of Amoraim, which is often the sugyot are ordered chronologically, but also because all the other sources quoted were tannaitic sources, and this is Amoraim. He quotes where we started yesterday. Rav Shmuel da Amrit Ravayo Kol Yoshel Adam Konelo Bechol Makom. Right, he doesn't quote the end, which is other than the public domain. What does it mean everywhere? Doesn't everywhere la tuye mai? What does that come to include? Lav la tuye reshut mocher. Does that not include in the possession of the seller? Meaning, sounds like, right? And this is what I mentioned yesterday, right? Why is Rav Sheshet asking the question if Rav and Shmuel already said the Kel Yoshel Lokach Konelo Bechol Makom? So that sounds like even in Reshut Rabim, or by Reshut Rabim, it's the only place it doesn't work. Sounds like in the store it would work, right? Even though it's the possession of the buyer. So Hatam da Amrle Zilkne, and this is what the Rashbam said. I read you the Rashbam yesterday. The Rashbam was based on this, which is that means if I go into a store, okay, let's do a summary before I even get to this. Okay, according to Rav and Shmuel, let's put we'll include Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish as well, but let's do a review of what we have. if I bring my kelim and I'm buying something and you give me the stuff and we'll put it in my vessels. If I'm standing in a simta, in a chatzir that belongs to both of us, in any sort of place where I have permission to put things down in, all the more so my own space, of course, right, I acquire it. If it's in the public domain where I don't have permission to put it down, or someone else's courtyard where I don't have permission to put it down, then it seems like, unless we explain Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish as saying that, I don't acquire it. But what happens in the house of the seller? So, option, right? We're now going to have two tracks within the house of the seller. And one is what Rav and Shmuel were referring to, and the other is what Rav Sheshet was referring to. Rav and Shmuel, when they seem to say, of course it works, and didn't have a question at all, must be talking about, because again, why must they have been talking about? Because there's no way Rav Sheshet would have asked this question if it was so clear according to Rav and Shmuel. So Rav and Shmuel must be talking about a case where already the seller said, I'm going to sell you these fruits, put it in your basket, and your basket will acquire it for you. Okay, the seller explicitly said those words. That's when it works in the domain of a seller. But if there was no mention of that, that's when Rav Sheshet asked the question. Okay, so it's a little bit hard to say that because it doesn't give any indication when you read the beginning, right? That Kel Yoshel Adam Konelo B'chol Makom. It sounds like everywhere. And if you look back at the Rashbam again that we read yesterday, now it'll make a lot more sense because we just explained it this way. B'chol Makom Afilu. I'm back on Pehamid Aleph, the first line of the Rashbam. Afilu b'reshut mocher, even in the domain of the seller. Ukigon da'amar lebehege yikne lecha kel yach. And it, for example, or the way this would work is if the seller said, your kelim will acquire this item, as we say later on, which is our sugya. Okay, so we bring Rav and Shmuel as an attempt to try to say, oh, it's obvious, it works. And then the Gemara says, no, not necessarily, because you could explain it that it's only a case if specifically it was the seller said, let your vessels acquire it. So that doesn't prove anything. So we're left, like I said from the beginning, we're not going to have an answer to this question, and we're going to move on. Tanan Hatam. Now they quote a very famous Mishna from Kiddushin that we've seen many times about how we acquire items. And now we're really going to talk about the kinyan of Meshicha and Hagbaha and the relationship between them. Hagbaha means to lift something. Meshicha means to pull something. So if you look in that Mishnah, it doesn't mention Hagbaha. It talks about Nechasim sheyesh lam achrayut. That's things like land, where there's a lien on them, there's responsibility, right? Like you sell it and then someone takes it away, you're going to have to replace it. Niknim bekesef ubishtaru b'chazaka. Okay, they're acquired with money, with a document. Okay, remember that we learned if it's a place where they normally write documents, then money itself doesn't really work. But if it's not, then money alone will work, or with a document, or with chazaka. Chazaka means we decided you were going to sell me your land, and then I went and I started plowing the land. Okay, we didn't sign a document yet or anything, but I started working the land, and you didn't stop me. That's an indication that you agreed and it was fine that I start the work and you already gave me rights to the land. That's not important for our purposes at all right now. Which is movables. The only way to acquire them is by pulling. Now, we're going to have a big introduction to the sentence because there's a big debate about who said it. Okay, but we haven't gotten to yet what was said. But Basura, in the city of Sura, that was a big city in Babylonia, Manula lahashmata mishmei Rav Chisda. They claim that the statement we're about to say, this qualification of that Mishnah, it was said in the name of Rav Chisda. Bepubedita, another big city in Babylonia, Manula b'shmei Rav Kahana, they said in the name of Rav Kahana. V'amri la mishmei Rava, and some people said in the name of Rava. So in these two different cities in Babylonia, Sura, Pubedita, they had different versions of who said it. So either Rav Chisda, Rav Kahana, or Rava said it. What did they say? Big line. Lo shanu ela dvarim she'ein darkan lahagbiya. When it says you can only acquire metaltalin by pulling, they only were referring to items that can't be lifted. But aval dvarim she'darkan lahagbiya, but things that could be lifted. Bahagbaha ein b'meshicha lo. Meshicha is not effective. Okay, and what this is saying is the most ideal way to acquire an item is hagbaha, lifting it, which makes sense because you buy something, you pick it up, right? Pick it up off the shelf, you pick it up. That's what you do when you acquire something. And therefore, only items that can't be lifted because they're too heavy, bulky, for whatever reason, you can't lift them, only items like that are acquired with Mashicha. So even though the Mishnah says very clearly, and yes, Terry, like the boat, that we talked about a boat being pulled, animals being pulled, right? All those things can't be lifted, although we're going to see today what kind of animals, we'll get back to that. But all those things you can do Mashicha. But if it can be lifted, you have to lift it. Mashicha won't be effective, even though the Mishnah said any movables, it sounds like, are only acquired with Mashicha. So this is a big deal statement because it really changes the simple reading of that Mishnah and is very limiting. So Yativ Abaye v'Ka'amar lahashmat. No, time passed. Abaye now goes and teaches what these rabbis, one of these rabbis, we don't know which one, taught. And Eitive Rav Ada bar Matna l'Abaye. And the first question is by Rav Ada bar Matna. He says to Abaye, wait. I have a source that proves the opposite. And now we're going to see, okay, it seems he's not the author of the rest of he's not the one who brought in the rest of these difficulties, but like in the previous sugya, we're going to have 4 difficulties. And like in the previous sugya, every source we bring, we're going to reject and say, oh, right. And the last time we tried to answer the question with these sources, now we're trying to raise difficulties with these sources, but each time we're going to say, no. You could understand that source differently, and it will work in with what was said. So Rav Ada bar Matna says the following to Abaye. Now, before we get into the source, I want to give you some background. It's things we've learned before, but we'll review. There's a principle in halacha called kim lebe de Rabbanit, which we'll learn a lot more in depth when we get to Sanhedrin. There it really talks about when we're talking about punishments in Sanhedrin. So we have this concept that if you do an action, that at the same moment that you do the action, you're obligated in 2 different things. Okay, presumably right now we're going to be talking about both the death penalty and payment. Okay, so you are obligated a financial payment to someone, and you're liable to get the death penalty. You are going to be exempt. Kim lebe de Rabbanit means you get the biggest punishment, which is the death penalty, and you are not going to have to pay that money. You're exempt. So here's our case. Hagonev kis b'Shabbat. You steal, okay, for our intents, we'll call it a wallet, okay, a bag with money in it, okay? Steal a bag, let's call it a money bag. You steal a money bag on Shabbat, you're chayav. Now, what happens here? You stole, which makes you obligated financially, and what did you do? You took the money, you took it out of the person's house, you brought it into the public domain, right, to get out of their house or some other domain. You're liable for Shabbat, from taking from a private domain to a public domain. So why are you chayav on Shabbat, right? Well, the reason is you shouldn't be chayav now. The reason, what they mean here, chayav, you have to pay the money for what you stole. But why? Because they didn't happen at the same time. First, you were obligated in theft. Why? Well, at what point are you a thief? When it becomes yours. Now, remember, we talked about this. And we spent a lot of time on this at the end of Bava Kama. If you learn Bava Kama, if not, anyway, I'll review it. When you acquire something, when you pick something up, okay, that's what we're talking about here. You picked it up in the domain of the person's house that you were robbing. When you lifted it, that's a kinyan. It's an act of acquiring. Now, of course, you steal something you didn't acquire. Nobody said, oh, you can have that, right? Acquiring takes 2. But you acquire it for the issue that you now have to pay it back the value it was then, okay? And you assume responsibility because you have to return it. So that's when the obligation kicks in for you to return the item you stole. So now they say the following. When did that happen? In the house of the thief. You haven't yet done anything that's forbidden by Torah law and Shabbat. Now it is, you could say it's muktzah, it's money. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about an Isra Malacha of taking from one domain to the other, right? You don't get the death penalty for muktzah or moving something you're not allowed to move. So anyway, when you obligate in Shabbat, when you go out, when you walk out the front door, right? That's when that piyuv kicks in. So first you had the money obligation, and only after did the Isur Shabbat come in, the death penalty. So therefore, you're going to have to pay. Kim lebed Rabbanit doesn't kick in. However, that source continues, but if you're dragging it on the floor, by the way, we learned this again. If you're dragging it on the floor, then you never lifted it, then you're patur. Because when do you become obligated? Mishicha is taking it out of, you pulled it from one domain outside to the other. We saw that in the braita before. Oshim shechena lirishuto, right? Or mirishuto. So in that case, it would be exempt. Because both happened at the exact same moment, and that's when Kimle kicks in. Bahare. Okay, it's the most severe, not the first violation. The first, and again, remember, the first violation means there is no Kimle. If there's one and then the other, you're obligated in both. If they happen concurrently, then you're going to have the exemption. And this is the only way they could happen concurrently. Now we got to our big question. A kis obviously can be lifted. It's a money bag. So you lift it up, right? And that's when you, in the first part of the source, you lifted it up, and that's when you acquired it. According to the second part of the source, when did you acquire it in that case? When you dragged it on the floor? When you pulled it outside of that domain. Well, what do you see here? It can be lifted, and yet you acquire it by pulling. Doesn't that go against what we just said? You can only acquire things by pulling if they can't be lifted. So Amar Abaye says, oh, no, that's b'mitna. That's if it had a rope attached to it. To which Rav Ada says to him, Ananami b'mitna kamina. Obviously, Megorer would say, I also understood it that there was a rope. What does that have anything to do with anything? That's not an answer to my question. It's still light enough to be picked up. Who cares if there's a rope attached or not? To which Abaye answers, no, you didn't understand what I meant. Amarle, or maybe I didn't clarify so well enough. B'midi debai mitna. Now, I said before, obviously, a money bag can be picked up. Now we're going to see maybe not obviously. And comes Abaye and explains that source must be, again, because it has to fit in with what he taught, must be talking about a money bag that's so large, so heavy. Imagine, remember, in those days, it wasn't paper. So it was coins. Imagine you had a money bag that was really big with a lot of coins that couldn't actually be lifted. Now, you have to explain, well, then why was it lifted in the beginning, right? The first part of the braita the first part of the, I can't remember if it's a Mishna or a braita. It might be a Mishna. I don't remember. I forgot to check, but it's a Tosefta in Bava Kama. Right, it's a Tosefta in Bava Kama, now I remember. So if you lift, it can't be lifted. What does that mean, can't be lifted? You'd obviously have to explain, most people don't lift it, but it could be you have someone super strong who decided to lift it, okay? But otherwise, it's normally pulled, and that's what we're talking about here. So what we're saying is we must be talking about a money bag that's so heavy, and that's why Mashiach could work. But if it were not that heavy, then Mashiach would never work. And that's how Abaye resolves that source. Second source, Tashma. This is back to the braita we saw yesterday. Birishut mocher lo kana ad bihenu o ad shiotzienu mirushuto. This was the Mashiach. You pull it out of the domain. So if it's birishut mocher, if it's in the domain of the mocher, you only acquire it either when you lift it in the store or when you take it out of the store. As soon as you walk out of the store, it's yours. What do you learn from here? Well, it's giving you two possibilities. Either lift it or drag it. So that sounds like, or pull it. It sounds like we're talking about the same item. And it's going to work either through lifting or through pulling. That seems to go against with whichever rabbi said this. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak litzdadim katani. No, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, what do you mean? That braita meant either by lifting or by pulling, each one depending on what kind of item you're talking about. Midi debar hagbaha bagbaha. If it can be lifted, then you acquire it by lifting. Midi debar meshicha b'meshicha. If it can't be lifted and it's normally pulled, then by pulling. And those are two different options that are given for depending on what type of object it was. So that doesn't contradict at all. Turning now to Abaye, source 3. Tashma, again, all these sources are difficulties on the fact that we say, if it can be acquired if you can lift it up, then you can't acquire it by pulling. And each of these sources seems to indicate otherwise, but again, can be explained to fit in with that as well. Tashma, now we go back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah on Pei Dalet had said, HaMocher perot lechavero, mashach velo madad kani. What did it say? You have to do mashicha, but not midida. Remember, we had that whole discussion in the beginning about how people maybe thought that measuring it was a way of acquiring it, but really it's by pulling. Now, ha-perot b'nei hagbahaninu. Okay, you go to the store to buy fruits. Do you pick them up? Of course you pick them up, right? Fruits, of course, can be picked up. They're not huge, heavy items. B'katane, dekane b'mashicha. And it says clearly in the Mishnah, it's acquired by pulling. That seems to go against again. To which the answer, it must be talking about gigantic crates of fruit. Right? Imagine you go, you've seen those big crates full of fruits in the fruit store. You can't lift that so easily. That must be what they're talking about. That you would do with Mashicha, and that must be what the Mishnah is referring to. So they say, wait a minute. Ihachi, but if so, look at the Seifa. The Seifa says, the continuation of the Mishnah says, Halokech pishtan mechaviro. If you take flax from your friend, lo kana ad sheyitaltalenu mimakom zeh lemakom acher. You're not going to acquire it until you carry it from this place to that place. Now that sounds like you're lifting it up. Now, if the beginning is talking about big packages, big crates of fruits, why would this not be talking about big crates of pishtan? Just like there's big crates of fruits, there's big crates of pishtan, in which case, why are we lifting it? Right? It doesn't make any sense. What, do they not put flax into huge crates also, like fruits? To which they answer, actually, they don't. And that's why it's talking about a different case. Why don't they? And this you have to think about exactly what they mean here. But shani pishtan de mishtami. Pishtan, you can't put, now maybe crates is the wrong word, but what they mean is like a big bundle. You can't put flax in a big bundle because it's slippery and they'll just start falling out, all the flax. All the flax will just start sliding out. So people normally carried flax in smaller bundles. And that's why there is no case of flax in a big bundle. And that's why it's acquired with Hagbaha. But the first part of the Mishnah is acquired with Mashicha. And that's because it must be talking about a huge amount of fruits that can't be lifted. Abaye Ravina le Rav Ashi. Again, it's not, this is what we call an ukimta. Ukimta are always a little bit of a stretch to say that, right? It's a bit of a stretch because it's not like people normally buy fruits in such large quantities. Though I guess if you're a distributor, yes, but not if you're an individual. Abaye Ravina le Rav Ashi. Fourth source to try to contradict the statement of, again, either Rav Chisda, Rava, or whoever said it, that then Abaye taught. Tashma. Behema daka, behema gasa nikne b'mesira. So a behema gasa, oh, okay. I see there was a lack of clarity about kimle, so I'm going to go back because I thought I was clear. It's always the severe one. That's what kimle b'derabamine means. You get the more severe punishment. You don't get the lighter punishment. Okay, so if it's death and money, obviously getting the death penalty is more severe than paying money. So we get the death penalty and not the money. Okay, we're going to learn a lot more about this as we, when we see it in Sanhedrin. But what I was saying, I'm not sure what caused the lack of clarity here, but if it's not happening at the same time, then you're going to get both of them. It's only if they happen at the same time, then you're going to get the more severe punishment and not the lighter one. Okay, like let's say you do something also that you could be liable to death penalties. So we go by which death penalty is the more severe one. That's the idea. I don't know what wasn't clear, but I hope that's clear now. Okay, back to our topic. Tashma. Now we're getting into animals. Large animals, cows, oxen, those type of animals. Camel, donkey. What do? You pass the reins to the person. You could also acquire it. Okay, we're going to see. Well, there's a question about Mashicha. Anyway, I'm not going to get into this so much right now. Small animals, though, you lift. Divrei Rabbi Meir Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Okay, so according to Rabbi Meir Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, in order to acquire a large animal, you pass over the reins. If you want to acquire a small animal, you lift it up. Okay, that so far sounds pretty, fine. Chachamim omrim, but the rabbis say, and here comes the problem, behema daka b'mishicha. A small animal like a sheep, a goat, is acquired by pulling. Now, right? We just said you could lift it. So if it can potentially be lifted, why are you allowed to do Mashicha? Sounds like it goes against what we said before, right? And it says here, right? You could lift it and yet you acquire it b'Mashicha according to the rabbis. To which the Gemara answers, Shane behema desarcha. When we talked about lifting objects, and objects that can be lifted can't be acquired by pulling, we're talking about objects that can be lifted not only because of their weight, but because it's easy to pick them up. But an animal is very difficult to pick up. Try to pick up a goat. The goat is going to fight you and try to keep their feet on the ground. And therefore, it's very hard to pick up. So while weight-wise it might work, And that's why Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar say we acquire it by lifting. And the rabbis and say it's too difficult to acquire by lifting, right? That's the whole idea here. If something is too difficult to acquire by lifting, we're going to come up with an alternative. So it could be too difficult because it's heavy. It could be too difficult because it's fighting you and it wants to stay on the ground. And therefore, they said Mashiach. So after quoting all these four sources, we end up concluding that it could, right? We at least haven't rejected this opinion that Mashiach may only work when Hagbaha is not possible, because lifting it is the real proper way to do a kinyan. And Mashiach is just a second, an alternative when Hagbaha is not available. Okay? It's not an option. And that's what, and again, I just want to point out, the Mishna very simply says, land is acquired with Keser Shar and Chazakah, and movables are acquired by Mashiach. And these rabbis basically say, no, Mashiach only works when there's Hagbaha. And you have to understand that Mishnah as it's just so obvious that you could do Hagbaha that they didn't even write the Hagbaha as the main way. They didn't even mention it, okay, which is a little bit strange, but that's how this is understood. Okay, the difference between Mashiach and Masira, we're not going to get into that today. That's also another whole issue that we've discussed in the past. I'm not going to start opening that now. We'll never finish, but that's also a discussion, what the differences are between Masira and Mashiach, which obviously is in this braita, in this source we just quoted, about the Be'emad Gasan, the Be'emad Daka. You can go look back. It's in Bava Kama Daf Yud Aleph. Go look there about the debate. Okay. Rav Shmuel. So until now, I'm actually just going to review the daf until now, and then we'll just finish up. We went to the review at the end because now we're kind of finished section 2. We had 2 sections. One was to finish up Kil Yosha Lokech B'Reshut Mocher, my own vessels, the buyer's vessels in the domain of the seller. Does that work or not? To which we brought 4 possible ways to answer the question, 4 sources, the last one being Rav and Shmuel, and then each time, right, as opposed to the other 3 with tannaitic sources, rejected everything. Nothing really gave us a good indication either which way. And then we did a similar type thing, but with a different gist, which was we had a Mishna, a limitation, a qualification of the Mishna, and then 4 sources that were all tannaitic that went to contradict that limitation, but each source was explained to actually potentially work with that qualification. Now we're going to learn another statement of Rav and Shmuel, and then compare it to a line in the braita, that long braita we keep quoting again and again from Daf Pei, this with Pei Hayam with Aleph. Yeah. Okay. Rav Shmuel de Amre Travai. And this is actually a sugya we learned in Bava Metzia as well, the end of Bava Metzia. Okay, and it's going to continue into tomorrow, but we'll do the first part of the sugya today. Core is 30 se'ah. You have to get all the numbers right. Okay, a core is made up of 30 se'ah of, let's say it's wheat. So you say to me, I'm going to sell you 1 core for 30 sela. Okay, now 30 sela, 30 se'ah for 30 sela. If you change your mind or I change my mind, any of us can change our mind, even right while they're measuring, we get to 29, 29.9, until there's a full core there, we can each renege. Because it was all viewed as one deal, because we said a core for 30. But core b'shloshim se'ah b'sela ani mocherla. But if we say, I'm going to sell you a core for 30 sla'im, and then you add the words to me, to the sale, 1 sela per se'ah, and you make it as if, it sounds like as if there's 30 separate deals going on. Because each se'ah is a seller. You're not just selling me the whole thing for 30. You're selling me kind of, one by one by one by one. And therefore, Rishon kana. Each one you give me will immediately be acquired. So you measure 1 se'ah, I get it. You measure 2, I get it. And we can't renege on any ones that were already fully measured because we view it as 30 separate transactions. Tashma, but now we have contradiction from this braita we saw. Im hayta midah shel echad mehem, rishon kana, va'af agav de lo nitmala midah. Now, the first part of this seems to indicate, and even theoretically the second part, we'll see. There's multiple ways to understand this, but let's point out the issues. Number 1, in that source that said, if the midah was both of theirs, which really means if it was the seller's, then it's all in the seller's hands until it gets completely filled. But if it was in the buyer's hand, and that's the important part, if the vessel was the buyer's and we measured it out into my vessel, then everything that was in the measuring cup is automatically mine as soon as it goes into the measuring cup. So what do you see here? Even though it's not full yet, okay? To which we say, well, couldn't this be a case where we say, kor b'shloshim, right? Just one amount, and therefore, how do we, right? According to this, it's not until you get to the top and it's completely full that it's going to be acquired by me. And even if you go by the second one and you say, maybe this is a case where we said very specifically, kor b'se'ah, right? Kor b'shloshim se'ah b'sela, still we're putting it in one measuring cup, it sounds like. And in one measuring cup, we're not measuring it one se'ah at a time. Sounds like, right, in that case, it said, if you said se'ah b'sela, then as soon as you measure each se'ah separately. But here we're measuring this, it sounds like, in one big measuring cup that has a core, and how could that possibly work? So, to which they answer, Kigon de amarle, him b'shnemasar slaim log b'sela ani mocher la. So the first thing they say is, it must have been a case, not like the first case in the Mishnah, in that source. Kor b'shloshim ani mocher lecha. It wasn't like that. It must have been that braita which said Rishon Rishon Kana, must have been like by us where it says Rishon Rishon Kana, that said se'ah b'sela ani mocher lach Rishon kor b'shloshim se'ah b'sela ani mocher lach, where you both said the whole amount and the smaller parts, but it's still not enough because we didn't measure it out by se'ot or by, right? So, and they give an example, by the way, of a hin. Hin is the measurement in the Torah. Hin is 12 log. So you said, right? So kigon de amarle hin b'shnemasar slaim. I'm selling you 12 log, but they called it one measurement of a hin for 12 slaim. Log b'sela ani mocher lach. And then you said the individual. Each log costs a sela. And then it would work. But uchida amar Rav Kahana shnatot hayu behin. Just like Rav Kahana said in the temple, when they would measure in the measuring cup of a hin, they had a hin measuring cup, which is 12 log, but there were lines inside, etched in, that told you where each log was. Hachanami, so just likewise here, shnatot hayu bamito. We're assuming. So number one, you would have to assume that braita was talking about, if it's going to say Rishon Rishon Kana when it goes into my vessel, it must be number one, that we already talked about in parts. Because if we didn't say each log for a sela or each se'ah for a sela, it really doesn't work until it's completely full. So we must have specified that. But in addition, you would have to add, though, there were notations, some sort of way in this big vessel that measured, let's say, a core, or whatever it was, a hin, that there were little etchings that said each log or each se'ah. And that's why what we're going to have, then there was a measurement, right? Otherwise, it's just like a big mush of stuff. We don't know how much it is. But if it's clear, and this sounds weird, the way they're describing it, like this is a chiddush, there were little etchings. This is the way all our measuring cups work, right? You have a 2-cup measuring cup, and it has 1 cup, and it has a 1/4 cup, and it has a 1/2 cup, and you have all the indicators in the measuring utensil of how, right? Even usually it's in liquid. In dry measuring, also sometimes you have it. Like you might have a 1 cup with little lines inside. Right? Nowadays they make things much, much better. In those days, it sounds like this was a bit of a unique thing because they had to quote, oh, by the way, they had this in the mikdash. They must have had it also as well here. And then that resolves the issues. Then you say each se'ah, as it was measured, it was noted how it was measured, or each log as it was measured, it was noted. And then you would have to say also, though, it was specified the price per log. Only then it would work. Otherwise, it wouldn't really fit with Rav and Shmuel. So that's how we understand the braita. Then we're going to go to another difficulty with this source, and that's going to start tomorrow. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day. And reminder that we're on a break from Zoom already at the end of today. Shiurim will go up early at 5 in the morning Israel time. And the Shiurim for Rosh Hashanah will all be up the week before Rosh Hashanah on Sunday. So you can get learning early for that. Wishing everyone a good day. And for those who I'm used to seeing every day and I won't be seeing, so Shana Tova, Gmar Chatima Tova. Bava Chatima Tova.